World War II ended on May 8, 1945. Church bells rang across Europe. Soldiers embraced in the streets. Families reunited. The deadliest conflict in human history was finally over. But on a remote island in the Indonesian archipelago, 10,000 German soldiers kept fighting for 2 more years. They weren't trapped behind enemy lines. They weren't cut off from all communication. They had radios. They received messages from Allied command. They simply refused to believe the war was over. These men maintained full military discipline, conducted combat patrols, and prepared for battles that would never come. They watched as Japanese forces surrendered around them. They saw Allied troops take control of the region. And still, they believed Hitler's Reich would rise again. This is the story of the last Wehrmacht unit to surrender in World War II. And the question that haunts historians to this day: how did 10,000 trained soldiers live in a delusion for 28 months after the war ended? To understand how this happened, we need to go back to 1943. By this point in the war, Germany was losing on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers were devastating German cities. And critically, Germany was running out of resources. Hitler's war machine needed oil, rubber, and raw materials. The problem? Most of these resources came from Southeast Asia, territories now controlled by Japan. Germany and Japan were allies, but the British Royal Navy controlled the shipping lanes between Asia and Europe. German cargo ships trying to transport vital supplies were being sunk before they could reach the Atlantic. Hitler made a calculated decision. If German ships couldn't safely transport Asian resources back to Europe, then Germany would send troops to Asia to secure those resources at the source and train Japanese forces in European warfare tactics. In late 1943, the German High Command assembled a force of approximately 10,000 men. This wasn't a ragtag group of reserves. These were experienced Wehrmacht soldiers, along with units from the 19th SS Division. They were told their mission was temporary: secure the Indonesian oil fields, train Japanese forces, establish defensive positions, and eventually return to fight in Europe. The journey itself was treacherous. German transport ships had to evade British naval patrols, navigate minefields, and cross thousands of miles of hostile ocean. But they made it. By early 1944, the German garrison had established itself on the Indonesian island of Java. For these soldiers, Indonesia must have seemed like a different planet. Instead of the bombed-out cities and frozen trenches of Europe, they found tropical jungles, monsoon rains, and temperatures that never dropped below 80 degrees. The local population was a mix of native Indonesians, Dutch colonials, and Japanese occupiers. It was a complex political situation, and the Germans were supposed to navigate it while maintaining their military objectives. And here's the thing: they were actually pretty successful. The German unit established well-fortified positions in strategic locations. They trained Japanese soldiers in German military tactics, including the use of machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and coordinated infantry assaults. They helped defend against occasional Allied air raids. They secured supply lines for raw materials. From the perspective of these soldiers, they were doing their jobs and doing them well. They weren't experiencing the constant bombardment and desperate retreats that Wehrmacht units in Europe were facing. They had regular food supplies, they built comfortable barracks. Some even learned basic Indonesian and developed relationships with local communities. But as 1944 turned into 1945, communication with Germany became increasingly sporadic. Radio messages from High Command became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The soldiers started hearing rumours through various channels. Berlin was under siege. The Soviets had crossed into Germany. Hitler might be dead. Their commanding officer, General Heinrich Kratz, dismissed all of these reports as Allied propaganda. and he had what seemed like good reasons. First, the Japanese commanders they worked with confirmed that the war was still ongoing, that Germany was developing superweapons that would turn the tide. Second, the soldiers could see with their own eyes that they were winning their local battles. The defensive positions held. Allied forces hadn't invaded their sector. Everything in their immediate experience suggested the war was far from lost. There's a psychological phenomenon at play here called confirmation bias. When you desperately want something to be true, you interpret ambiguous information in a way that confirms your beliefs. These soldiers wanted to believe Germany was winning, or at least holding its own. So when Kratz told them the surrender rumours were fake, they believed him. May 8th, 1945. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. In London, Paris, New York and Moscow, millions of people flooded the streets in celebration. The Nazi regime had fallen. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. In Jakarta, Indonesia, the German garrison's radio operator received an official message from Allied command. It was clear and unambiguous. Germany has surrendered. All German military forces, regardless of location, are ordered to cease combat operations immediately and prepare for repatriation. The radio operator brought the message to General Kratz. Kratz read it carefully. Then he called a meeting of his senior officers. In that meeting, he made a decision that would extend the war for his men by more than 2 years. He declared the message to be a fabrication. Psychological warfare, he called it, an attempt by the Allies to demoralize German forces and trick them into surrendering before the Reich's inevitable counterattack. Now, you might wonder, how could an experienced military officer believe something so absurd? But put yourself in Kratz's position for a moment. He'd spent 18 months in Indonesia. His information about the war came through heavily filtered channels. The Japanese, who hadn't surrendered yet, supported his interpretation. And perhaps most importantly, accepting the truth meant accepting that everything he'd fought for was lost, that his country was destroyed, that the ideology he'd served was defeated. Sometimes it's easier to believe a comfortable lie than face a devastating truth. Kratz's officers debated the issue, but ultimately most sided with their commander. They had no independent way to verify the information. They couldn't just pull up the internet and check the news. They were isolated, thousands of miles from Europe, dependent on whatever information came through official channels. And the official Japanese channels backed up Kratz's assessment, so the German garrison continued operating as if the war was still ongoing. They maintained their defensive positions. They conducted regular patrols. They held formations and enforced military discipline. Business as usual. Then came August 1945. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. World War II was definitively, undeniably over. And still, General Kratz refused to accept it. This is where the story becomes truly surreal. The German soldiers watched as Japanese forces throughout Indonesia began surrendering their weapons to Allied forces. They saw Japanese commanders meeting with British and American officers. They watched Japanese soldiers stack their rifles in town squares and march away to POW camps. Kratz had an explanation for this too. He told his men that Japan's surrender was tactical, not genuine, that Germany and Japan would regroup, that new alliances would form, that the war would continue in a different phase. Some of his officers began to express serious doubts, but Kratz's personality was strong enough to maintain control. He'd kept them safe for 2 years. Most of the men still trusted him. As 1945 turned into 1946, the situation became increasingly absurd. Allied forces were establishing control throughout Indonesia. The Dutch colonial government was returning. Indonesian nationalists were fighting for independence. And in the middle of all this political upheaval, there was a pocket of 10,000 German soldiers, living in isolated jungle camps, still believing they were serving the Third Reich. Some of the younger soldiers started deserting. A few joined Indonesian independence fighters, believing they were continuing the fight against the Allies. Others simply melted away into the local population, took Indonesian names, married local women, and tried to forget they'd ever been Wehrmacht soldiers. But the core of the garrison remained intact. They grew their own food. They hunted in the jungle. They maintained their weapons. They created a strange bubble of German military order in the middle of the Indonesian wilderness. Months passed. The German soldiers listened to radio broadcasts about the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were being prosecuted for war crimes. Kratz dismissed these as Allied show trials, propaganda meant to demoralize Germans worldwide. The soldiers heard about Germany being divided into occupation zones. Kratz said this was temporary, that the German government in exile would reclaim the homeland. For every piece of evidence that the war was over, Kratz had an explanation. And without access to undeniable proof, enough soldiers continued to believe him. By mid-1947, Allied intelligence had compiled reports about the German holdouts in Indonesia. At first, commanders thought it was a small group of stragglers, maybe a few dozen men who hadn't gotten word of the surrender. When they realized it was 10,000 soldiers operating under organized command, it became a diplomatic priority. In September 1947, a joint British-Dutch military delegation travelled to the region where the German garrison was believed to be operating. They brought overwhelming evidence, official German surrender documents with signatures from Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's successor. Photographs of bombed-out Berlin showing the scale of destruction. Copies of newspapers from around the world covering Germany's defeat. Filmed footage from the Nuremberg trials. Testimonies from thousands of German POWs who'd been repatriated and interviewed. They also brought something else? German officers who'd surrendered in Europe and volunteered to help convince the holdouts. These men could provide first-hand testimony that the Reich had indeed fallen. When Allied forces finally located the main German encampment, they didn't attack. They established a perimeter and requested a meeting with the garrison's commanding officer under a flag of truce. General Kratz initially refused. He believed it was a trap, but after several days of negotiation, he agreed to meet with the Allied delegation on the condition that he could bring armed officers for protection. The meeting took place in a clearing in the Indonesian jungle. On one side, Allied officers in clean, pressed uniforms. On the other, German officers in faded tropical uniforms, armed but outnumbered. Between them, a folding table covered with evidence. The Allied commander laid out the proof methodically. He started with the official surrender documents, explaining that these bore the seals and signatures of Germany's legitimate government after Hitler's death. Kratz examined them carefully, looking for signs of forgery. He found none, but remained skeptical. Then came the photographs. Images of Berlin in ruins. The Brandenburg Gate still standing, but surrounded by rubble. The Reichstag damaged and covered in Soviet graffiti. Entire city blocks reduced to skeletal buildings and mountains of debris. Kratz's hands started shaking as he looked through the photographs. These weren't images that could be easily faked with 1940s technology. The scale of destruction was too vast, too detailed. The Allied commander showed him photographs of the Nuremberg trials. Nazi leaders sitting in the dock, facing charges of war crimes. Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop, and others Kratz had once considered the Reich's elite leadership, now prisoners being judged by an international tribunal. Then came the testimonies. German officers who'd fought in the Battle of Berlin described the final days, Soviet artillery pounding the city, Hitler's suicide in the bunker, the desperate negotiations for surrender terms. These weren't Allied propaganda officers. These were German soldiers, men who'd served with honour, explaining what had happened. One of the repatriated officers had served in the same division as Kratz before the war. They knew each other. "Heinrich," the man said, "it's over. Germany surrendered. The war ended 2 years ago. These men deserve to go home." General Kratz sat in silence for a long time, staring at the evidence spread across the table. His face went through a series of expressions: skepticism, confusion, dawning realization, and finally, complete devastation. When he finally spoke, witnesses reported that his voice was barely a whisper. "What have I done?" The weight of his decision crashed down on him all at once. He'd kept 10,000 men fighting a war that didn't exist. He'd prevented them from returning to their families. Some had died in the jungle from disease or accidents that never would have happened if he'd accepted the truth in 1945. Soldiers who could have been home rebuilding their lives had instead spent 28 months in isolated delusion. Kratz stood, removed his officer's cap, and formally surrendered his command to the Allied officers. Word spread through the German encampment quickly. Some soldiers broke down crying. Others sat in stunned silence. A few became angry, feeling betrayed by their commander, but most just felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion and loss. The repatriation process took several months. The German soldiers had to be processed, documented, and cleared for return to Germany. Many were in poor health after years in the tropical climate. Some had contracted malaria or other diseases. All of them were psychologically scarred by the realization that they'd lived in a collective delusion. The transport ships carrying them back to Europe arrived in late 1947 and early 1948. As the German coast came into view, the men crowded the deck rails. What they saw broke many of them completely. The Germany they'd left in 1943 no longer existed. In its place was a landscape of ruins, cities reduced to rubble, a population traumatized and starving, a nation divided by the victorious Allies into occupation zones, the economic infrastructure destroyed, the political system dismantled. Many of the soldiers couldn't find their families. Homes had been destroyed in bombing raids. Parents and siblings had died in the war's final brutal months. Some soldiers discovered that their families had assumed they were dead and had held memorial services years earlier. The psychological toll was immense. These men had survived the war physically intact, had spent years in relative safety in Indonesia, while their countrymen had suffered through the worst horrors of modern warfare. Survivors' guilt mixed with the shame of having been deceived, creating a psychological burden that many carried for the rest of their lives. General Heinrich Kratz faced a military tribunal, but the Allies struggled with how to charge him. He hadn't committed war crimes, he hadn't brutalized prisoners or civilians. His crime was more subtle. He'd been unable or unwilling to accept reality, and that delusion had cost 10,000 men 2 years of their lives. Ultimately, Kratz was released without significant punishment. The tribunal determined that while his judgment was catastrophically wrong, there was no evidence of malicious intent. He was a broken man anyway. He spent his remaining years in obscurity, reportedly never speaking publicly about what happened in Indonesia. The story of the last Wehrmacht soldiers to surrender raises profound questions about human psychology, leadership, and the nature of belief. How do we know what's true when we're isolated from reliable information? What responsibility do leaders have to question their own assumptions? How does ideology blind us to reality? These weren't stupid men. They were trained soldiers, many with combat experience, but they were operating in an information vacuum, led by a commander who couldn't face the truth, in a situation where believing comfortable lies seemed easier than accepting devastating reality. There's a final, haunting detail to this story. In the decades after the war, historians researched whether other isolated German units had similar experiences. They found scattered evidence of small groups, a U-boat crew that surrendered months late, a garrison in the Arctic that didn't get word until weeks after VE Day. But the Indonesian garrison was unique in its scale and duration. 10,000 men, 28 months. A complete, organized military unit living in collective denial while the world moved on without them. Today, the jungle camps where they lived are overgrown and lost. The Indonesian government hasn't marked the sites as historical locations. For the most part, the story has been forgotten. A strange footnote to the larger narrative of World War II. But for the men who lived through it, and for the families who waited years longer than necessary for their return, it was anything but a footnote. It was 2 years of lost time. 2 years that could never be reclaimed. The last Wehrmacht soldiers to surrender didn't lay down their arms because they were defeated in battle. They surrendered because they finally, reluctantly, painfully accepted that the war they were fighting no longer existed. And in some ways, that's the saddest ending of all. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Forgotten Front for more untold World War II mysteries. Next video drops in 3 days. We're covering the Nazi gold train that vanished with $6 billion and was supposedly found 70 years later. You won't want to miss it.